Okay, welcome everyone to episode number 2 of Technique Tuesday. Before we get started with this episode, I just want to quickly say thanks to everyone for all the amazing feedback on the last episode on the bench press. I do tend to get a little bit of pushback, especially when it comes to setting up the arch for that exercise. But honestly, the comments in that video were just amazing. So thank you so much for all the support. So in this episode, we're going to be taking an in-depth look at the Pendlay row, which we can actually think of as a sort of very strict variation on the standing barbell row. Now, the original Pendlay row, coined by American Olympic weightlifting coach Glenn Pendlay, was originally used to develop explosive power off the ground for Olympic athletes. But for our purposes here, which will mainly be to build the muscles of the back, we're going to be modifying the exercise in a few important ways. So with this movement, we're going to be performing shoulder extension, which will be carried out mainly by the lats and to a lesser degree the long head of the triceps, transverse shoulder abduction, which will hit the rear delts, and then scapular retraction, which will be handled by mostly the mid-traps. Also with the Pendlay row, because you're so bent over, there will be an isometric lumbar extension contraction held by the spinal erectors of the low back throughout the whole movement. And this is important because not only will bigger, stronger erectors help to strengthen your deadlift, they'll also lead to the appearance of a bigger back overall, since they run all the way up the spine, leading into the lats and traps, sort of enhancing their appearance as well. So we're really hitting the entire back with this one, with no real loose ends. And while the biceps will assist with the elbow flexion component of the lift, I would consider this exercise more of a back builder and not a bicep builder. So to set up the Pendlay row, make sure the bar is evenly loaded on both sides, and you're using the safety clips. Safety clips are actually pretty critical here because an unclipped bar will most likely cause the plates to progressively shift off the bar on each rep, and it could lead to increased risk of injury. Now, generally speaking, you want to load this movement in a more moderate rep range, usually in the 8 to 12 rep zone. And if you just do too much weight with these, your form is inevitably going to break down. You'll probably start using a lot of leg drive, hip drive, and so forth. And because the Pendlay row puts your back in a mechanically disadvantageous position on purpose, if you're either loading it too heavily or doing too many reps, it can accumulate fatigue in the lower back, which might interfere with any deadlifting that you have later in the week. Now, just as a point of reference here, you can see Dr. Mike Israetel at around 250 pounds body weight and with extremely impressive lat development, using 235 pounds here. And just notice how his form is perfectly controlled, and each and every rep looks more or less exactly the same. So with this exercise, rather than thinking, why is someone this big so weak? You instead want to think, why is someone this big using less weights than I'm using? So just for reference here, something just under 1 times body weight might be a good high-end strength standard to aim for in that moderate rep zone. All right, so you want to approach the bar similar to how you would a conventional deadlift, setting up with roughly a shoulder width stance. If you have longer legs, you may need to use a slightly wider stance or externally rotate your feet out a little bit so that your knees don't get in the way of the bar path. You want to bend down and grab the bar by pushing your hips back so that your shins are kept vertical, with the barbell positioned in the midfoot to toe area when viewed from the side. Grab the bar with a double overhand grip, going slightly wider than shoulder width. You want to make sure you pick a grip width that allows your upper arm and lower arm to make a 90-degree angle at the top end of the range of motion. You can use chalk or straps to help with the grip if it allows you to focus more on pulling with your back muscles, but since the loads shouldn't be that heavy anyway, I don't think they should be necessary. From here, you want to anteriorly rotate your pelvis, or in other words, pop your butt out like in a bikini pose to pull your spine into a completely neutral position. Now remember that the spine is naturally curved, so if your lower back is totally flat, it is in fact slightly flexed, which under load and in this position certainly is less than ideal. Now, if you aren't able to reach the bar on the ground without rounding your lower back, I'd really recommend elevating the bar up on some bumper plates or using aerobic risers to help shorten the range of motion a little bit and allow you to keep that safer neutral spine position. You want to start each rep with your scapulae slightly protracted and then initiate the movement off the ground by pulling your shoulder blades together. You want to drive your elbows up and slightly back so that when viewed from the top, your arms are traveling back at about a 45 to 65 degree angle relative to your torso. Over tucking here is really going to prevent the traps from working properly, while over flaring may take the lats out of the movement and put your shoulder in a more compromised position. So generally speaking, more flare will mean more trap involvement, and more tuck will mean more lat involvement. But all in all, I would say a 45 to 65 degree pulling angle is going to hit all the muscle groups back there pretty evenly. The bar should make contact with your lower sternum, just around nipple level. And to finish out the concentric, you can think about really squeezing your shoulder blades together at the top to really nail the mid-traps. Lower the bar under control while focusing on keeping your shoulder blades retracted until the plates are just a few inches above the ground, at which point you'll want to protract your shoulder blades and let the plates come to a dead stop on the floor. Now, to keep more constant tension on the back, you can just do a controlled touch on the ground. However, a true Pendlay row does have the weight come to a full and complete stop to reset the stretch shortening cycle and force a dead stop pull on every single rep. Now, throughout the entire positive and negative, you want to maintain a lumbar spine isometric contraction, forcing the low back to stay neutral. And you want to keep your head in a neutral position as well. Now, a little bit of neck flexion or extension shouldn't really hurt, but jerking your head up or down might make it harder to fully retract your scapulae and maximize on the lift. Okay, so by far, I would say the most common error that I see here is just simply going too heavy. Most of the time, if you just strip the weight back and focus on getting the form right, all of these other errors will automatically correct themselves. And you want to really try not to be one of those lifters who let their form slip in the name of progressive overload. And remember that adding weight to the bar really only counts as progressive overload when form is consistent. Now, the second most common error that I see is using too much leg drive or hip extension to force the weight up. You'll want to remember that while there will be exceptions, the best studies do show that full ranges of motion tend to be better for maximizing strength and size gains. And in order to maximize range of motion for the lats on any row, your torso should be close to perpendicular with the line of pull, meaning that your chest should be pretty close to parallel with the floor throughout the range of motion. If you look up and you can see the lettering on your shirt at the top end of the range of motion, your chest is probably rising up too much. Now, I also want to quickly mention a good substitute exercise here, which is going to be the Helms row, where you'll have your upper chest positioned against the top of an inclined bench, resting it on a towel or a pair of knee sleeves. And you want to still row with a nearly ground parallel back angle, but this time using dumbbells. And this alternative is great for people who can't help but use excessive leg drive on the Pendlay row, since here your chest is forced to stay pinned up against the bench. I do find that the Helms row is best performed with slightly higher reps, more in the 12 to 15 rep range. And while this is a nice, very strict alternative, because you'll be rowing back a little bit more than rowing out, I do think of this alternative as more of a lat dominant row than a trap focused row. But with that said, if you do focus on scapular retraction throughout the ROM, you'll still hit the mid traps to a pretty significant degree. Now, one potential downside here is that you may not beef up the spinal erectors quite as much, especially if you don't deadlift or squat regularly, since you're going to lose that isometric lumbar extension contraction with this variation. So if you can do it properly, I still think the Pendlay row is an important part of any complete training program. And if you want to completely maximize your back development, I would consider this to be about as close to an absolute must as there is. All right, so that's going to conclude this week's episode of Technique Tuesday. Over here next to my head, I'll have a link to the last episode on the bench press. Make sure you check that one out if you haven't already. Make sure you hit up the button over here to subscribe to the channel so that you don't miss future Technique Tuesday episodes. Hit the like button if you're enjoying the series so far, and I'll see you guys all here next Tuesday.